So we are now in public session. Before I begin, can I please just, as always, remind members to turn off mobile phones. I would like to welcome Colm McCarthy, Economist, University College Dublin, and Dr. Stephen Kinsella, Associate Professor of Economics at the University of Limerick. Thank you. You're both very welcome, and thank you for making yourselves available to us today. Obviously, we've been holding our pre-budget consultation hearings since April, and included engagement with economists from the PBO, IFAC, the ERSI and NE or NERI. Just about every collection of alphabet soup you could have possibly there, I've just noticed as I start to read it out. We're delighted obviously to be joined by the two of you as nationally recognised economists and to hear your perspective on Budget 2020. So before I ask you to go into opening statements, I would just like to do the normal bit of housekeeping in terms of the privilege. So just to say that you are directed, I wish to advise that by virtue of Section 17(2)(I) of the Defamation Act 2009, witnesses are protected by absolute privilege in respect to their evidence to the committee. However, if you are directed by the committee to cease giving evidence on a particular matter and continue to do so, you are entitled thereafter only to qualified privilege in respect to your evidence. You are directed that only evidence connected with the subject matter of these proceedings is to be given, and asked to respect the parliamentary practice to the effect that where possible you should not criticise or make charges against any person or entity by name or in such a way as to make him or her identifiable. Members are reminded of the long-standing parliamentary practice to the effect that they should not comment on, criticise or make charges against a person outside of the Houses or any official either by name or in such a way as to make him or her identifiable. So, with that concluded, I'm going to start today with Mr. McCarthy. Colm, can I ask you to make your opening statement? Approximately 6 minutes is allocated for this today.
Okay, well, I've circulated some notes, I think, yesterday, so I just want to run through a few points very quickly. It's my view, and it's a view that I'm sure you've heard from the entire alphabet soup that the chairman referred to, that we really should probably have tightened budget policy a few years back as the recovery matured, and we're now in a position where if things get troublesome, we don't have as much latitude as we might have had. You can finance government spending by raising tax revenue, by selling government debt, or if you have your own currency, you can get the central bank to buy government debt, or you can just print currency. There is no possibility here, since we abolished the currency in 1999. We use essentially an external currency, so we cannot create liquidity for the government via the central bank, and that's a constraint. The implication of that is that if the government ever does wish to run deficits, and there are perfectly good reasons why they might from time to time, then those deficits can only be financed through the sale of government debt in the market. Now, we'll all remember that back in 2010, despite 2 years in which the government did everything they could think of, they raised taxes and cut current spending and cut capital spending, and failed to retain market access, and we ended up in an IMF program, as you all know, the Troika program. The trouble with leaving yourself in that situation is that you end up having an austerity program that's not really of your choice and whose timing is not of your choice. Okay, this is year 6 of an expansion. The economy began to recover nearly 6 years ago. The budget is balanced again, as Mr. Finance is pointing out in his statement earlier on this afternoon. That's true. And it's tempting to argue that expenditure increases or even tax cuts can be afforded. Whoops, I'm getting the hang of this. But the difficulty is that there are various icebergs out there. There will be a public finance crisis at some stage over the next number of years. There always is. The reasons for expecting a slowdown include the end of the recovery phase, the external environment is difficult, and of course Brexit. I still haven't got the hang of this. The point about recoveries is that they end. You can only recover once. If you start off with 16% unemployment rate, which we did, and it gets down to 4.5, which is where it is now, you can't repeat that. You cannot use up spare capacity in the economy more than once. And there are already labour shortages in many sectors. Over 300,000 jobs were lost during the downturn. There was net outward migration, as you know, very high unemployment. But a period of very rapid employment growth, as we've seen, eventually exhausts the excess labour supply. You know about the external environment. There's a risk of a trade war. A slowdown in the USA, should it happen, and the recovery in the USA is pretty mature too, and the US economy is pretty close to full employment, I think. If there's a slowdown in the USA, it hits Ireland a bit harder than elsewhere. One of the reasons we've done well the last few years is that the US has been doing well. And the US is a big export market for Ireland, and it's also a big source of inward investment. And it cuts both ways. If things slow down in the States, it'll hurt us a little bit more than it will hurt others. The medium-term prospects in Europe are not very encouraging, and of course Ireland is very exposed to Brexit. This is a slide, I'm conscious at the time, of the unplanned component in spending increases recently. It's from the recent report of the Fiscal Advisory Council. And this is a particularly worrying feature of the last few budgets. I think the economy was clearly recovering quickly 3 years ago, and arguably we should have tried to move the fiscal position into a stronger place as long ago as 2016. You can see there have been big spending increases in each of those years over and above what was voted by Dáil Éireann. These are the unplanned increases which had to be funded with supplementary estimates. The big worry, which was highlighted by the Fiscal Advisory Council, is corporation tax. It's very volatile, and corporation tax revenues could weaken for cyclical reasons, or because there are changes in the international corporate tax regime. Along the way, there have been steadier sources of tax revenue proposed, and they've been sacrificed, particularly water charges, but also the property tax, residential property tax that's been introduced has been kept at fairly low levels. These are stable sources of tax revenue. Here's another one. We tax cars on purchase quite heavily. We have VAT when you buy a car, but we also have vehicle registration tax. The number of new cars sold in Ireland fell by 2/3 during the crash, with several hundred million vanished in purchase taxes on cars. There's an alternative. You can tax fuel, or you can tax cars annually, and we do both. And when we were trying to get the volatility removed from the tax base, one of the proposals that was considered but wasn't implemented was to get rid of the big purchase tax on cars and push up fuel tax and push up the annual tax to make up the lost revenue. That doesn't get you any extra revenue. It'd be the same, but it'd be less volatile. And it's worth reminding ourselves of that. New car sales virtually disappeared from 2007, early 2008, until 2010. It wasn't as big a collapse as with stamp duty on property, on commercial property and residential property. But that is a transactions tax. There are others. Inheritance tax is kind of a transactions tax, since a lot of it is related to the realization of property assets on death. Capital gains tax is a tax on the realization of capital gains. Now, there's good reasons for having taxes on capital or wealth or whatever, but there are still quite a few taxes in the Irish tax code that are transactions type taxes. and we really need to move away from them. So there is a risk in current policy, and people who draw attention to the high level of outstanding sovereign debt and contrast that with the very low level of sovereign debt, which didn't save us. The opening level of sovereign debt the last time we got into trouble didn't save us, because we borrowed so much so fast and the banks went bust that we ended up in an IMF program anyway, even with a very favourable starting position relative to where we are now. So the people who are saying that we should have been more cautious about budget policy the last few years and that we should continue to be now are not saying that there aren't occasionally reasons to run budget deficits. But the other side of the coin is that you really should be running budget surpluses when things are going really well and when you've got full employment. And the benefit of doing that is that you will avoid the imperative of unplanned and badly timed austerity down the road. And that's the big risk. And the last two governors of the central bank and various people in the ESRI and the OECD and the IMF and all sorts of people have been pointing this out the last few years, that because Ireland is now a heavily indebted country and because these very low government bond interest rates are not going to last forever, we are vulnerable if there's a slowdown internationally, and particularly if there is a resumption of trouble in the Eurozone bond market. So that really is the case for being cautious about budget policy and the case for lamenting that we haven't been cautious in the last few years. It's not because there's anything wrong with deficits. It's fine to have an active stabilisation policy, but you need to ensure that your balance sheet is in a position to sustain it, and ours isn't. And we really ought to have reassured the volunteer lenders on whom we will have to rely unless we want to go into another IMF programme. We should have commenced to reassure them already that we have the budget in small surplus and try and keep it there. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much. And now, Dr. Kinsella, if you'd like to make your opening statement or remarks, again, approximately 6 minutes.
Grant. But thank you again very much for the invitation to speak. I guess I have relatively similar points to make with Colm, so I'm not going to repeat much of what he said. I agree with wholeheartedly, but if you have two economists in the room, you do not have one opinion, you probably have three. So I will, I want to do two things. First is to place Ulster where we are right now in its international and historical context. That's number one. And number two, to discuss things this committee can actually do, can actually sponsor, and can push forward in terms of the budget scrutiny process for the government. The first, I think this is really important, Elva Bova from the IMF and her colleagues, they looked at the fiscal impact by crisis type for many different types of crisis. So crisis of state-owned enterprises, their percentage of GDP costs, subnational governments when they get into trouble. So this is a data set from 1970 to today from all across the world. And you see two things pretty quickly coming out of this. The first is that the average cost of a crisis is about 3% of GDP, right, across all the different types. The financial crisis is the most expensive in terms of the cost, the fiscal cost, the actual cash cost to the taxpayer, which, as Colm rightly said, didn't come because we printed a load of money. We didn't get out of it that way. We got out of it by simply borrowing more. And you can see Ireland there at 39%, the total cost of bailing out the banks and everything else. So it's the fourth largest bailout of any kind anywhere in the world. So that's the first and most important point to recognise. We tend to be relatively insular when it comes to our debate here, and I want us to understand that this is the scale of the crisis we wish to avoid. That's the first thing. The second thing is to understand that over time, so this is the same data, but instead, rather than ranked by type, it's now ranked over time. You see us there in 2007, 2008. The dot above us is Iceland. And I've done a lot of work comparing the crisis in Iceland and Ireland. You would imagine they'd be relatively similar, but when you dig into the detail, they're very, very different stories. Iceland, in particular, is a story of firms that built up too much debt, whereas Ireland is a story of households. But to echo Colm's point, when you look at the volatility of the tax heads, the various tax heads, and this is from the Parliamentary Budget Office, one of the excellent new institutions that have been founded in the last couple of years to increase the amount of economic analysis we can do. If you compare the mean rate of growth, which is on the horizontal axis, on the vertical axis, to the volatility of that. So, in other words, if you treat the tax head like a financial asset, so you compare its rate of return with its risk. And volatility is a way of measuring risk. You see capital taxes are up there at the top. Then you see corporation tax and stamp duty way out there. And then you see excise duty, income tax, customs and VAT at the bottom. So the most predictable, the most stable, the least volatile, they're down there in the bottom left-hand corner. And the problem that everyone has highlighted, this is over 1984 to 2017, the problem that everyone and their cat at this point has highlighted is that corporation tax. It's highly volatile, but the problem is it's been volatile upward. It's been growing and growing and growing and growing. And what's happened is as the rate of expenditure has, as the rate of taxes have come in, the rate of expenditure has leveled up to match it. So if you compute the forecasts of spending from the Department of Finance, 2010, 11, 12, 13, they just level up like that. Okay? And the worry that everyone has is that there's going to be a shock to corporation tax. But everyone's talking about a negative shock. I think an almost greater risk is that there's a further increase in corporation tax in the next little while. We tend to think in terms of negative risks, downside risks, but there are also upside risks. If the rate of corporation tax increase continues for the next 2, 3, 4 years, we could be in this position that Ireland was in 2005. So today, imagine today was 2005. So stamp duty receipts were at their all-time high in 2007. So imagine if we were there in terms of our corporation tax. In other words, we have another 2 years of it growing, and with that unsustainable growth, the level of expenditure growth comes up. And then the bottom drops out of it. That's the worry I think I'd have. If you look at the changes in the sources of our tax revenue over, this is kind of 20-odd year period, we see that every time there's a period of crisis, it's the income tax that's used to flex and to make this thing, to make the economy work. And successive governments, as they've come into periods of growth, have weakened the income tax lever and the income tax head, and it's magically appeared from other areas, for example stamp duty, and then obviously nowadays corporation tax. If you look at what we use it on, we essentially spend our money on paying people and current tax transfers. Despite all the noise about the National Development Plan and everything else, it's essentially a payment system. While that's a pity, it does mean that by definition, if you decrease government expenditure, you automatically hammer transfers, and that means that we will increase inequality. I really like this chart, and not just because it took me ages to make it. I really like this chart, and the reason I really like it is, again, it puts us in our international perspective, right? So Ireland is down there in the middle, and what you see there is we spend a fair whack of our money on social protection. Actually, we spend a fair amount of it. Now, there are categorization issues, and as the OECD always has categorization issues. But if you see us there in the middle, we spend kind of 32.7% on social protection. We spend a fair whack on health, and then there's kind of everything else. We're a traditional Northern European state in this sense, but we don't actually spend as much on social protection as other states. So when we'll come to talk in a minute about automatic stabilizers, and I'll come to that in a little minute, I'd like you to keep this in mind. Internationally speaking, we don't actually spend as much on lower income households as other wealthy states. Now, what can this committee do? essentially, this committee exists to increase the amount of budget scrutiny. We should never have a situation where the Minister of Finance stands up and says things and the Cabinet are like, what? Really? Right, we shouldn't have that as an outcome. We want a far more stable budgetary process. So in the 1960s, Richard Musgrave had this framework, and he said basically the public finances should do three things: stabilise the macroeconomy, have an efficient resource allocation, and then redistribute resources. You've just seen how we redistribute our state's resources relative to the rest of our economy. The resource allocation element is difficult because it's quite difficult to compute the efficiency of it, and we know that there's going to be a macroeconomic stabilisation element to what we have to do in the next little while. We know this is going to be a problem, Brexit or otherwise, and the summer economic statement has just come out a couple of hours ago, and it talks a lot about this. So this blue box is where we are in the budget cycle. We're at the budget preparation stage, but actually what I would love to see for this committee in particular is to really sponsor far more analysis around the budget cycle. So this is a really important point. If you compare Ireland in 2019 to Ireland in 2005 or 2006, the level of economic analysis we can do now is far greater than it was. When you compare us today to the Department of Finance, for example, that was described in the Wright report, they're very, very different animals, okay? But we still haven't filled out the institutional architecture that a country like the Netherlands has, or a country like the United States has. We still don't have, for example, dynamic scoring. It's not possible for a political party to come along and say, we'd like to introduce a wealth tax, how much is that going to cost, right? It's not, these things are not done yet. In particular, we haven't got a study that says, say corporation tax drops by 5%. How much is that going to cost? Where's the money going to come from to fund overruns in education and health? That doesn't exist, right? We can't do fiscal stress tests. And I think fiscal stress tests should be something this committee should sponsor. I really do think that. The other thing I think is quite useful is to sponsor the development of policies around automatic stabilisers. So when I talk about automatic stabilisers, what I mean is us getting away from this discussion, which is that we talk about the 2.8 billion that's left after we pay for everything, or we talk about the budget envelope around the fiscal space, right? I think we need to get away from this particular debate, which is the debate on the extra increment. I think we really want to get a debate on the larger issues of the day. And the way to do that is to have an institutional architecture that's largely independent of the budget cycle. In other words, this particular process that the executive is going to deal with. I think what you'd really like to do is find a way to integrate the Climate Advisory Group, the Fiscal Advisory Group, and the National Risk Assessment. If you could find a way to bring the knowledge from all three of those things together, which basically talk about aspects of the same function together, under this committee, if this committee could sponsor that work, that would be excellent. And the reason it would be excellent is they're kind of the same thing. With a bit of extra costing, you might be able to inform the development of budgetary strategy into the future. Finally, this is the picture based on the Stability Programme update. So you have, sorry, no, this is actually from the Fiscal Advisory Council's excellent report. So these are the baseline, this is GDP by volume. And if you can see the vertical axis there, you see that it goes between 140 and 120. So the range of outcomes is extremely high. And I think communicating that level of uncertainty to the public is really the job of this committee, and particularly the members of the Oireachtas, because I'm not convinced, and I'm somebody who talks to people a fair bit about the economy, as you might imagine. I'm not convinced that people really understand what the likely downsides of this are for them. And I believe that deeply. I think people are still waiting for that. It's going to be bad, or it might be bad, is not, I don't think it's scientifically precise enough for most people. So let me stop there, and again, thank you very much.
Thank you very much. That's both for very interesting opening remarks and presentations. I'm going to obviously open it up. I have a couple of people who have indicated already. So, Deputy Lahart.
Thanks, Chair, and thanks to both our, I think we call you witnesses for some strange reason, but thanks for your service over the years. particularly Colm, obviously has done the state quite a bit of service over decades. Just some questions. It's interesting what you're saying, just an observation or two. First, Stephen, I think that some of the work that we've done in the last few months, we have picked away at those common themes that have been coming up here as a new committee, certainly over the last 2 years, those common themes of corporation tax, you're exposed to it, carbon tax, the last year's budget, you need to do something about it, petrol and diesel equalisation, you need to do something about it, and these. So from an objective point of view, this is what I like about this committee. I think it's important for us to try to be objective here. There are political differences. When we go back to our parties, that's where the politics comes in. But you're right, there have been missed opportunities in relation to stable sources of revenue. LPT was one, you indicated that. And they have been fudged, and I think that's pretty objective. But we have also asked, I mean, the most recent people we asked were IFAC when they were in most recently, and the IMF in informal discussions with them was, how do you know corporation tax is going to drop? And because the answer was well, because it can't do anything else but drop eventually. That's just not scientific enough. I mean, we all believe that's going to happen. The IMF were the only ones who gestured to some degree that there's some bit of modelling done about this. And I do take your point, and if we have time, I think in terms of trying to model out what are the consequences of a 5% drop in corporation tax, and how do we fund ourselves in the absence of that. So, first question is, I mean, have ye any greater insight as to, we're getting, I suppose, a bit more of a picture as to why it has ballooned in the last 2 years. Have you any insight into the beyond 2020 scenario and why it would, besides the obvious stuff that's obvious to lay people like me, American pressure on the whole corporation tax piece, have you any insight you can offer the committee that is different to what has been given us before, to us before, in terms of the likely longevity of this? The rate, the revenue dropped last month, but we're told that, and we were told that May is the biggest month and June is the next biggest month, so we'll be watching out obviously for the. Have you anything that you haven't said about corporation tax that you think needs to be said to a budgetary oversight committee and hasn't been said?
Yeah, well, Stephen was careful to avoid predicting what's going to happen to corporation tax revenue. And this is the big point that I thought Seamus Coffey and his colleagues were making, that it's just inherently very volatile. When we decided here in the early 1990s, Chairman, to have a low rate of corporation tax, we used to have a 40% rate for services companies and 10% for manufacturing companies. That had to go. And it was decided to do two things simultaneously. One was have a low rate for everybody, and 12.5 was chosen. The second thing that was decided at that time, and people have forgotten this, was to cut out a lot of the loopholes. There used to be a magnificent stunt called Section 84, I think it was called in the Finance Act, and the banks actually didn't pay 40%, and lots of people didn't. So we had a pretend rate of 40%. Which a lot of people didn't pay. So the decision taken in the early 90s was we'll have a low rate of corporation tax, but the snag is you have to pay it. Right? And lots of European countries pretend to have high rates of corporation tax. If you look at the data, they don't collect as much as you would expect given the high nominal rates they have. There's a lot of hypocrisy internationally about corporation tax. But what's happened in the period since, for reasons which I'm just not an expert on, is that with the benefit of lots of lawyers and tax accountants, the corporations have found endless ways of not paying even the 12.5%. And they've managed to route profits through Ireland that really belong to the US Treasury, a lot of them. But there are weaknesses in the US tax code, and marrying that with the international tax treaties and a quick detour through the Dutch tax system and so on. These outfits have been able to route a lot of tax through here, taxable profits through here, and pay us some money, but avoid paying somebody else even more. This wasn't the intention of the corporation tax reform in Ireland in the early 1990s. That wasn't what we set out to do, but it's what's eventually happened. I think where we are now, to answer Deputy Lahart's question, is it's just very volatile. And what Coffey and his colleagues have said is that a portion of the bonus unexpected receipts in recent years should not have been put into the state budget at all. We should have said thanks very much and used that money to reduce indebtedness. In the longer term, I agree with Stephen, you'd like not to be so dependent on this volatile source of revenue, but the way to be not dependent on it is precisely that, to use the unexpected corporation tax revenue to pay down debt. On the other point about volatility, there are the Parliamentary Budget Office people have written a couple of very interesting papers about volatility in tax revenue, and Stephen mentioned one of them. I think they've looked at a 7-way breakdown of tax heads, and they've looked at the volatility in each one, like in VAT and excise duties and income tax and so on and so on. I think they could break them down a bit more, and there are a few volatile tax heads lurking inside some of these aggregates, which something could be done about. I mentioned VRT, it could be substituted with fuel taxes and stuff like that. Final point, very quickly. If the government succeeds in getting everybody to drive electric cars, and Minister Burton announced that we're going to all be driving electric cars in 10 years' time or whatever, last Monday, that will be a revenue disaster for the Exchequer, because you cannot dye electricity green the way you have green diesel. So the fuel tax component will become problematic if it's electricity. As I understand it, technically there's nothing you can do about that. And we have huge subsidies now, so we can afford to subsidise electric cars with BIK relief and all the rest, as long as nobody takes you up on the offer. But if people start saying, God, that's a great idea, and everybody races off and buys electric cars, then those subsidies will be withdrawn. They'll have to be. And we'll have to dream up a new way of taxing road transport. I'm not against having significant taxes on road transport at all, but the way we do it now is going to have to be reviewed, and we may end up, the Tax Strategy Group last year mentioned this in their mid-year report, we may have to look at congestion charges, more modern methods of tolling and so on, because we may end up without a fuel tax, or without a big slice of the fuel tax.
So just to, again, very briefly pick up on the 2 points. The great value of this committee is that it's strategic, right? So it's able to think beyond the day-to-day. And if I was going to advise the committee to do anything, it would be 3 things. One, these fiscal stress tests really matter. We really need to know if, so for example, if property taxes, if half the country wake up tomorrow and decide, I am not paying my property tax, it will have absolutely no impact on the budgetary surplus of the state, because it's less than €1 billion. If half the corporations wake up tomorrow and say, we're not paying corporation tax, we can't afford the health system, right? So it matters which taxes don't get paid. It matters where the volatility is. So that's number one. Fiscal stress tests should be part of what this committee reports on, number one. They're not difficult to do. The Parliamentary Budget Office can do them. You had the IMF in here. They sponsor, they have a developed methodology. It's actually not difficult. You could do it with an Excel spreadsheet. The second thing I think that is really important is that we understand that corporation tax is just the one that's volatile now, right? In 5 years' time, in 5 years' time, if we move to it looks like via the BEPS process, it actually looks like we're going to have a coordinated tax system where we're forced to have our corporation tax go up from 12.5% to, let's say, 17%. But that's true of everyone. And so we may end up flushed with loads of corporation tax revenue. That's an upside risk. But I would argue that we still shouldn't spend that massively, because we don't understand what's called the tax elasticity. We actually don't understand the responsiveness. We don't understand if you jack up the price, if you jack up the corporation taxes that a small number of corporations actually pay, what is the impact on their behaviour? We don't understand what that is. We're actually going to be an interesting experimental case study for that, but only interesting to the people who get to study it in the future. It's going to suck to actually do it in the present, and politics is of course about the present. So the final thing is about automatic stabilisers. So if you read the economic statement, it's basically two budgets. One is business as usual, and the other is we let automatic stabilisers do the job and we just go into deficit, which is grand, except Ireland has a very poorly developed set of automatic stabilisers. So we have unemployment assistance, we have job seekers and so forth. You're all aware of all these, but we don't have the kinds of stabilisers that kick in when unemployment goes to 7% or 8% or 9%. We don't have those things, and we haven't designed them. And what you all know, and what we all know now, is that it takes 9 to 12 months to design one of these policies properly. And so if you don't have them ready to go before the crisis happens, then you're 9 to 12 months along before you can introduce them. And this is a fundamental thing. Like, you just can't do these things right away. The Bureau, you know better than anyone, this is how, the system takes a long time to do things, even in a crisis. So I would really urge the committee to think carefully about what kinds of automatic stabilisers are out there. There's a lot of new thinking out there on this, and one particular one is an automatic offset for the motor tax, right? So you can start. So if it turns out that 2/3 of new cars are electric vehicles, there's an automatic offset. So the state's finances don't automatically get walloped, right? In one way. But the crisis is the wrong time to develop these policies. Absolutely the wrong time. The time to develop policies is now, before the economy really starts overheating.
Just a second question, very briefly.
Yeah.
So look.
I'm just conscious for everybody here that the economic statement kicks in at 6:05. I appreciate people have to be in the chamber for it as well. So just in terms of, not for you, Deputy Lahart, because you're always brief, but replies maybe.
So look, Brexit has been, I think it's fair to say, characterised by chaos over the last 2 years. And I don't think you'd need to be particularly bright to suggest that there's no reason why that ought to change, and that it looks like it's just going to continue to be characterised by chaos. So you mentioned, Stephen, just the government's twin budget approach. But again, to a layman, it looks like, well, there's only one real option that you can take here. This is going to be chaotic into the future. So it looks like it's going to be disorderly at best now for a continued period of time. Can you give us any brief, both of you, insight into the impact that's already had on the Irish economy in terms of maybe withdrawn investment or suspended investment, if you have any insight into that, and what you would do if you were advising the government in relation to the budget in October, with Brexit as its context?
Well, very quickly, I had thought later last year that the economy might have begun to show a bit of weakness by now, just because of the maturity of the recovery. You know, this is year 6 of a recovery. Unemployment, the last figure was 4.4%, which is not far off the all-time lowest figure. So I had thought there might be a bit of a slowdown. The very recent figures do not show that. The economy seems to be trundling along just fine. The UK economy has weakened. In particular, there has been a weakness in the UK in business capital formation, which is a really vital number for the long haul. And it's probably due to uncertainty about Brexit. It wasn't that strong to begin with, and it's weakened since the referendum. Here, I haven't a clue really what form Brexit is going to take. I don't think anybody in British politics has a clue either, so I guess I can be excused. And I don't know what the impact here is going to be. I fear that the impact, even if it was a soft Brexit, is going to be negative. It's difficult to see any Brexit outcome that will not leave scars on the Irish economy and, of course, on the British economy. So, as for the budget coming up in October, It seems to me there shouldn't be any giveaways at all in the budget in October. No tax cuts, no generous expenditure allocations to anybody, no sweets, no gifts for everybody in the audience as in the last 3 budgets. And if that's done, there will be a bit of extra latitude to deal with Brexit fallout, which is unknowable at this stage.
Thank you.
Just again, really quickly, the real impact is already being felt. So I work at the University of Limerick. We are very successful in getting in European research and development money, Horizon 2020 and its successor Horizon Europe. And we have colleagues that we work with in Oxford, Cambridge and at Warwick. And these are very fine, world-class academics. None of them are part of the projects that we're putting in right now for 2020, 2021. So it's a very good, simple, concrete example that's tens of millions of euros that would go to the United Kingdom's economy that simply is not going. And if they turned around and they said, lads, there's no Brexit at all, that money still wouldn't go to them, right? So that's a permanent decrease in their GDP. It's a small example, but it's a perfect example of what I mean. That's just from my own personal experience. If I was advising the Minister for Finance, I would be far more specific about the nature of the sectoral bailouts that I'd be talking about. In the event of even a soft Brexit, as Colm says, there's agri-food producers that are going to get walloped. And I would love there to be comfort to these people and to these sectors, to the businesses and to the people who work there, that they're going to be looked after, that they're going to be okay. There's literally one line in the Summary Economic Statement that says, we'll have a look at bailing some people out. I want far more detail than that, and I would be disclosing more of that. Now, I presume that the good officials in the Department of Finance have those sectoral bailout plans built and ready to go, and I'm sure you're privy to them, but if they don't, I would be applying shoe leather to areas of the body to make sure that those things do get designed. Because again, you can't do these things in 5 minutes. They take time to develop properly.
Okay.
Thanks, Chair.
Deputy Boyd Barrett, you were next there.
Thanks, and thanks to both Colm and Stephen for very interesting contributions. I mean, do you think that, notwithstanding the sort of the dangers and the threats that you've kind of outlined, that there are certain problems that we just have to address, and that they are going to cost money. And if we certainly work in with that within the discretionary sort of fiscal space or whatever that we're talking about, it's just not enough money to deal with those problems. You know, and I don't need to list them, but I think we know what they are. There are issues like housing, childcare, primary care, water infrastructure. You know, you can go through the list, right? Public transport. So there's a lot of demands, I would say urgent necessities, that we've got to invest in. And yet we have this small fiscal space. And I mean, isn't the sort of logic of what you're saying, and you seem to be kind of pointing in that direction, that we have to find extra sources of revenue?
Sorry, I don't usually do this, but just from the point of view of fairness, I'd like to, before you reply, I'd like to maybe let you finish your questions and then let Deputy Doherty in as well, just so as you can both get your questions in, conscious of where we are time-wise. And I know both of you probably want to be in the chamber to hear the Minister. Would that be correct, or do you have some?
Yeah, that's fine. I mean, yeah.
So I don't know if you have some more questions you want to place, and then I'll go to Deputy Doherty.
Yeah, and I mean, you talked about stable sources of revenue. So I mean, that's my first question. But the stable sources of revenue, and I mean, I take your point about volatile corporation tax heads and so on. Could you give some examples of the more stable? I mean, the ones that I would point to is things like employers' PRSI, which is very, very low.
Water charges, Rich.
we agree to disagree on that one. What would you say about financial transaction taxes? What would you say about wealth taxes? And do you think there's also just, again, you kind of pointed to it with the opening up of loopholes. I mean, an awful lot of discussion, our committee has started to look at this, generally speaking, focuses on expenditures, government expenditures, what is going to be spent in capital and current. But much less attention is given to tax reliefs, tax credits, allowances and so on. And we're starting to look at those now. But to me, when you look at some of those, there's huge scope there to kind of, and we should be just as forensic, just as focused on those tax reliefs and allowances and all that as we are on the kind of budgetary expenditures where there's a huge amount of focus anyway. Yeah, I think that's all I regret to ask. Yeah.
Just working on something here, just looking at the TV there, they're only on 3, so they're not going to start on time, so we have a little bit more flexibility on time there. So,
well, then can I ask one last question?
Yeah.
And just, I mean, on, you know, given the possible Brexit impact, the likelihood being somewhat negative, or the, you know, a downturn, all the possibilities that threaten us, the downside risk, would you say that one response that we have to do is to radically diversify our economy from over-dependent on a couple of sectors? And that's our best sort of medium to long-term insulation against some of these vulnerabilities that we have. I mean, you mentioned the agri-food sector, and you say, okay, yes, we should design supports, and obviously there's a good case for that because a lot of people. But on the other hand, you might argue in the context of climate and all the rest of it that we need to be scaling down parts of the agri-food sector. And we need to be thinking how, rather than just bailing those sectors out, we should be thinking about how we can get a just transition for the people working in those sectors into more sustainable, diverse forms of agriculture. Anyway, just to throw that in as well.
I'm going to let you answer, Deputy Boyd Barrett, because we do, I think, have a little bit extra time than I thought we had.
But very quickly, Deputy, you raised 3 points about fiscal space, and there is some, according to the Minister's statement today and so on. It's very important to remember, though, all the time that there is a real resource constraint in the economy. If the government, suppose the government didn't have a lot of debt, supposing it was, you know, we had a really strong balance sheet, and we could readily go off and borrow a big heap of money and safely do that. You don't have a big heap of real resources to reallocate with that money. Or to put another way, if a few thousand guys are heading off up the mountains of Ireland to, with trenching machines to put in broadband, they are not going to be available to build houses. So the idea of financial balance for the government is the mirror of the balance in real resources for the economy. So we cannot summon non-existent resources out of thin air, even if we didn't have a financial constraint. And it's important to bear that in mind. And the ESRI were hinting at that in some of their recent reports. If you really do want to spend more money, for example, on provision of care services, for example, you actually have to raise taxes to tell people stop buying ice cream, because some of the folks who are making the ice cream actually are going to have to go off and work for the social services people. There's a real resource constraint in there which is mirrored by the financial balance requirement on government. That's not true if you've got piles of underemployed resources and the capacity to borrow. But if the Fiscal Council are right and we're running out of underemployed resources, then we have to make choices. The choices may well involve, we want to spend more on various things of the type that you mentioned, but that means we have to raise taxes and hit the consumer in the pocket so that they stop buying ice cream, or whatever else it is that they currently do. And we have to always bear that in mind. On the second point, you were asking about more reliable sources of tax revenue. There are lots of possibilities for looking around the options. I mentioned some of them. We still have a fairly low level of residential property tax here. We do at last have a residential property tax which was abolished. Residential rates, I think, were abolished in 1978, was it? Or thereabouts, around that time, and we finally got them back, but at a fairly low level. Most people in the United States pay a couple of $1,000s a year in local, state and municipal property taxes, and in most parts of Europe they do too. They also pay for water. So those possibilities are certainly there. You also mentioned doing away with tax loopholes. There are tax loopholes, but you want to be careful about some of them. Stephen mentioned that our overall spending on social transfers, if you compare it with some of the Western European countries, it's higher than some, but it's lower than others. But some of the others have a state-run, pay-related pension scheme. In Germany, you pay a slice of your income into, but they pay pay-related pensions. In Ireland, that's done privately, so that's not in the government accounts. And you could put it into the government accounts, but we don't. So there is an issue of comparability there, and we offer certain tax breaks for people who make private pension provision. But if we didn't, then the state would be doing it, and you have to always bear that in mind. On the final point that you raised, oh yeah, you asked about wealth taxes and so on. Yeah, you could have a wealth tax. Every country in the world that has introduced wealth taxes, France being the most notable example, have ended up collecting not a whole lot of money. And here in Ireland we have a partial gross wealth tax, which is called property tax. And there is huge resistance to it, including, bizarrely, on the political left, which is a source of great merriment to a lot of people, but there you go. But you could have higher property tax, you could have wealth taxes of various kinds.
I'm just going to, thank you, I'm just going to let Stephen come in there for a brief if you have anything else you want to add.
Yeah, very quickly. So yeah, wealth taxes, site value tax. Just do a site value tax. It will stop. It will be hugely unpopular, and it will stop any asset bubble developing the property. It'll also generate a huge amount of money. The financial transaction tax. I was in it when this first came across my radar. I went, no, this is a poor choice. And then I've since become really aware of the scale of the shadow banking system in this country, which is absolutely phenomenal. It is on a scale comparable to very few other economies on earth. And I really, if you look at the gross flows in and out of this economy, they're comparable to much, much, much larger economies. So we facilitate the transfer of money in and out of different types of investment fund. This generates very few jobs. The social benefit to us is really low. So my thinking on a financial transaction tax has actually changed quite substantially. I think it will be a good thing because I view it the same way I would view a pollution tax. You should do it to discourage a certain type of behaviour. And given the scale, and we're talking 8 to 11 times the size of our economy, it's absolutely massive, this sector. So a financial transaction tax would be very, very welcome to introduce, but it would also have the extremely poor downside of being highly volatile. Finally, on the diversification of the economy, I agree with you. We do need to diversify our economy. We do need to scale back, but you never want to be in a situation where you're scaling back in the middle of a crisis. If you want to do it, you do it in a strategic way with policies. You don't do it as part of a crisis. And so I would still argue that strategically the right way to think about it is what form should local taxes take? What form should site value taxes take? Both of those two things increase the amount of democratic control that the average citizen feels. They fund local services, obviously, and then most importantly, they discourage bubble-type behaviour, and I think that all those things are positives.
Okay, I'm going to Deputy Doherty.
Thank you. Thank you, and thank you to our guests. I'm sure many viewers of this, if anybody's looking, they might be getting chills down their spine when they see Colm McCarthy come before Oireachtas committee. They're saying, are we heading for bust again? And I think, Colm, your presentation today is about avoiding unplanned austerity, and I think is timely given the probably current position we are in terms of the cycle. So I welcome your presentation, and Dr. Kinsella's too. Look, my time is brief, and it's a pity that we didn't have more time, but we have the summary economic statements. I'm actually going to start with that. Because you mentioned in relation to the role of this committee, and obviously we can only work with the kind of statistics that are provided. So if I look at the summary economic statement, and I'm sure you've got to kind of glance through it, we see in Table 3, it gives the budgetary projections 2018 to 2024, and it says, and I quote, it sets out the key fiscal metrics consistent with the SPU 2019. These projections represent the basis for the summary economic statement. So it says it's taken from the SPU 2019, it forms the summary economic statement. But IFAC, our own Fiscal Advisory Council, have said the following: the expenditure forecasts in the SPU are not credible. They are based on technical assumptions which do not reflect either likely future policies or future costs of meeting existing commitments. The technical assumptions used imply an implausible slowdown in expenditure growth, overstating the likely budget balance. And this is extremely frustrating, that we have now a document here which is fantasy stuff when we're looking at, and when we're looking at expenditure, budget surpluses and all the rest. And we're having this debate, Stephen, then you say it's the wrong type of debate, but we're having this debate about the 700 million that the ESRI says isn't there. Fiscal Council are saying fantasy stuff, and we're told that they're being listened to. But this is nonsense. Like, that's my view. I would welcome your views in relation to that first question, because it provides the basis on what we need to build up from then, and look at policy choices and options, and see where the threats are and the risks really are. So, do you want to give a...
Yeah, well, first of all, I thought the Fiscal Council report was really very comprehensive. Once upon a time, before we had a Fiscal Council, the role of grumbling about budget policy was the role of the Governor of the Central Bank, and they all did, to no great effect. I'm really pleased now that we have a distinct state agency to grumble about fiscal policy, and that the Central Bank is left to supervise the banking system, which they didn't do a very good job on, you may recall. It is displacement activity for central banks to whinge at finance ministries about budget policy. I think we now have a better allocation of functions. I thought the Fiscal Council report was really technically a terrific piece of work, and I read this kind of stuff for a hobby, and it's one of the best documents. I think Stephen would agree with this. That's been produced by the Irish Public Service for a long time. It did make the comment that Deputy Doherty just quoted, that the fiscal projections were not credible. And since then, we have learned that there is an overshoot coming in health this year, which the Fiscal Council didn't know when they wrote that part of the report. They also pointed out that Christmas is going to happen this year, and there is a Christmas bonus, so-called, in some of the social transfer payments, and it's not provided for, even though it is the intention of everybody that should be paid. And some things are unpredictable, but Christmas is not one of them. I think it's unfortunate that the figures in the SPU had to be described by the Fiscal Council as not credible.
I think just to, again, echo what Colm said about the the value of having independent agencies that produce analytical work to this quality. It's a highly valuable thing. They can't be dismissed as mere grumbling, but it is their function to sound these alarms. And I would really like to see a formal reply from the Department of Finance setting out why they think their assumptions are credible, and haven't seen that to date. For my money, having gone through the report very carefully, the Fiscal Council's arguments look valid, but we haven't seen a reply from Finance, or at least I haven't read one, to say, well, this is why you guys are wrong. Right? And I think that's a very, very important point. I would like to see a formal note from Finance to IFAC saying this is what we think should happen. The second thing is this idea of fiscal space as a notion. I think we're mandated to talk in this way by the European semesterization process. But I have to say, having experienced it now for 5 years, it's a nonsense. I mean, £1 billion gets found in the back of a couch. Like, it's not an actual constraint upon our behaviour as a polity, and that's not a good thing. I think if you want to compute these things, you want to talk about them seriously. I think the first thing you need to do is assess the level of credibility of the budget envelope. So one of the things I'd be looking for, particularly from Finance into the future, and I'll be talking about this tomorrow a bit at the National Economic Dialogue, is this precise function. I think we do need to debate our assumptions a little bit, particularly as we move into a very uncertain time. Like, we're going to see a period into the future where even computing these things for a small open economy is not going to be that credible. Just forgetting about whether the money that comes in is accurate to the money that's forecasted, just the actual forecasting methodology for a small open economy, probably not right. Like we're being forced to do it in the same way, we're forced to treat the Irish economy the same as the German economy. And that's just nonsense. Yeah. So for those two reasons, I would like to see a much healthier dialogue between IFAC and Finance, because right now what seems to happen is the dog barks and it is ignored, right? And I would like there to be some kind of conversation.
But the dog has been proven correct, because they said that the projections last year were not credible as well. They've used stronger language here, and last year they were proven correct because they've seen a €1.2 billion in year-on-year expenditure increase.
Indeed.
And I think it's important to say the Fiscal Advisory Council believe that more money is going to be spent than is what is projected for, because the level of projection at 2.6 or 2.4 for 2021 is nearly half of what has been spent over the last 2 years, and it's simply not credible. But look, I'm running out of time, so I'm going to ask 4 questions, and I'll be very brief in these. Overheating, a lot of talk in relation to overheating. We know the causes. There are multiple causes in relation to the last crisis, but commercial property was the core of the last crisis, as opposed to residential property, and NAMA is the manifestation of that there, which was a commercial property vehicle. Commercial property is overheating. In my view, I've got concerns that we may have the emergence of a bubble in relation to commercial property. I've written to the Governor of the Central Bank, the former Governor now, over a year ago in relation to this, and in fairness to Philip Lane, they carried out a piece of work which was just published this week, which actually raises some of the issues that I had. We gave examples of the leveraging of some of these funds and the sharp exit from the market and the impact it could have to commercial property, and then the knock-on effect it could have to banks and the wider economy. I think it's an important piece that's published. I would ask your assessment in relation to commercial property, but I also would ask, is it not, given the pressures that we have in terms of housing and given the pressures we have in construction workers, is it not the appropriate tool to use to actually now increase again stamp duty on commercial property to try and divert construction workers away from commercial property and into building social, affordable and cost rental and rental housing for the domestic market? That's the first question. The second one is that Colm McCarthy pointed out in relation to you can't do some of these things twice, for example, unemployment rates and all that. So you need to focus on less low-hanging fruit, if you want to call it that, and look at labour force participation rates. And what we do see in the summer economic statement is that they are actually marginally dropping, particularly for women. So is it not now that we need to look at other levers, for example, the cost of childcare and really investing in that to actually support labour and increase labour force participation at a time when we are now going to repeat a bit of the cycle where we appeared in the past. So that will require investment to do that. I was going to ask in relation to the health overspend. All the indications we've got from the Parliamentary Budgetary Office is significant overrun in health this year again, and the Christmas bonus not being factored in. These are two obvious things. But the damage, these documents, despite the fact that the figures aren't credible, the other part that lacks credibility is then what happens by the end of the year is completely different from what is voted upon, you know, and how do we actually deal with that? My view on this year is that if you budget in an unreliable way, like if you don't provide enough resources in the first place, then of course it'll be deemed as an overrun. It can also deemed as a under provision in the first instance. So we need to get that right. Then the last point, and unfortunately, Stephen, I don't have time to go into the detail of I think what was a more important discussion in terms of how do we look at these fiscal stabilisers and how do we set ourselves up as a committee, and if there was individuals who we think we should be talking to or who I would welcome if you could send some ideas to the committee. In my view, I think it's an important point. But one of the ways that we have increased our budgetary position outside of the fact that we're relying on corporation tax receipts that are at windfall level and so on and so forth is the cost of debt has significantly decreased. And this year will benefit nearly €500 million from the fact that debt cost has gone down. So it's not a factor of the domestic economy. Something can happen in Italy and things can spiral very, very quickly in relation to debt costs. So I would want your view on that. The ECB are telling us that debt costs are likely to remain the same, and we're in a golden position here at this point in time in terms of costs. But how vulnerable in terms of the spike of costs as opposed to the magnitude of debt that we have? That just we obviously have Brexit, and that's been talked to death, and we need to plan properly in relation to that. But I think there is a serious vulnerability that is maybe outside our control in terms of an increase in debt, which isn't going to remain at this level for the medium term to long term.
Yeah, can I take the last question first? The National Treasury Management Agency has done a lot of reorganisation on the time profile of the national debt. They have a very good website that explains all this. And the situation that we're in now is the following. We have a very big inherited burden of exchequer debt. It is true that the annual debt service cost that goes into the current accounts is several billion lower than we all thought it was going to be a few years ago. You mentioned 500 million, I think you said, for this year. Actually, if you look back 5 years at what people were expecting would be the debt service cost in the current year, the difference is 3 or 4 billion. 3.5 billion, something like that. So we've been very lucky. But that has happened in part because of the promissory note deal that was done with Draghi, who managed to, how do I put it, atone for some of the sins of his predecessor, Monsieur Trichet, and took some of the debt service costs of the pro notes off the Irish Exchequer. In addition, because of the QE that was operated by the European Central Bank, the NTMA has been able to replace more expensive debt with cheaper debt. And they've managed to sell some longer-term bonds. They've managed to manage the maturity structure quite well. I think they've done a good job down at the NTMA. So we now have a situation where we have a very big pile of debt. It's not very short-term. Actually, there are some rollovers in the next few years, and they're not trivial. But it could have been a lot worse. And they've managed to push some of it out further through borrowing 10 and 15-year money at very low rates. Now, if short-term interest rates in Europe go the wrong way because of a screw-up in Italy, there's an election in Greece as well, and there could be political instability there. The real danger is not that our annual running interest bill will suddenly shoot up, because it can't. It's fixed, most of it, right? The real risk is that the market could go bananas again, as it did in 2010, 2011, particularly in 2012, when various countries actually couldn't borrow at all. The bond market just froze up. And that's a bigger risk to us than, they can't increase the coupons on fixed coupon debt that's out there. But you could find there's rollover risk, because we have significant rollovers over the next few years. And I'll put it to you this way. Ireland was a Mediterranean country a few years ago. You didn't notice the temperature changing, but it's got reclassified now, maybe a little bit undeservedly, as a Northern European country, and our classification could start slipping southwards again very easily if people start looking at the numbers. And on the numbers, the ratio of debt here to tax revenue is not as bad as Greece, it's not as bad as Italy, but it's close. And we've got a bit more of a best boy in the class label than we deserve. And people will start focusing on those numbers again if things get messy.
Very conscious for Deputy Doherty that we have started the statements. If there's anything, Stephen, that you want to come very quickly back in.
Just really quickly on overheating, I have a big worry about the commercial debt space. It's totally understudied. That's why. I just don't know how big it is. On the labour participation rate, investing in childcare is quite helpful, but actually if you could reform the higher education system so that we didn't, so for example, I have a friend, she really wants to go back to college, and she can't, because I can't tell her when her lectures are going to be, so she can't organise childcare. So the higher education system not flexible enough at the moment. On the connection between how much you vote for, so you guys actually vote for this stuff, and how much we actually pay, the answer is program budgeting. If you literally paid by radiology and by oncology, as opposed to here's a load of money for the health system, you'd be able to see which bits are performing and which bits aren't. So program budgeting has been around in the US since the 1960s. It's the way forward, and we should just do it. I will send you a list of ideas, people to talk to. And the final thing is on the cost of debt. The debt is large, but it is far away. Yeah. Right. So unfortunately, for us, the rollover risk is quite great, because we get classified very, very easily with other small open economies, and that's something that we just need to manage. But yeah, if I had to pick one thing for you guys to take away, it's the idea of sponsoring research into program budgeting. We can do it. It's not rocket science, and if we did, we'd know which bits of the health system worked and which bits didn't.
That would be very helpful, I must say.
Okay, thank you very much. Can I thank you very much for your contribution to us today. As I say, I am sorry that we had this restriction on our time, but that is the way these things go. I would like to thank you for coming in, and I'm going to say that we will now, our meeting is concluded, and we will now stand adjourned until Wednesday the 3rd of July at 1:30 p.m. 2nd of July, sorry. 2nd of July. Sorry, just to clarify, it's the 2nd of July at 1 o'clock. We changed that earlier on in our private session, so apologies. Thank you.